Hello, my name is Juan Ramos, and my presentation will be on the U.S. and Mexican relations since World War II. My thesis throughout the presentation will be that Mexico and the United States had numerous disputes, mainly over territories. Political and economic factors across the border caused migration into the United States. The NAFTA is what ultimately paved the way for a closer relationship between Mexico and the United States. So my first example is the Bracero program. The Bracero program was the first official labor program for temporary workers, and it was a response to a severe wartime labor shortage in the United States. During the time of the Bracero program, more than 4.5 million Mexican laborers were sponsored, and this program also paved the way for many unauthorized immigrants into the country. Most of them who worked in agriculture and railroad industries, who were often exploited by their U.S. employers. My next example is when Truman visited New Mexico. This was a very important example because Truman was the first president to visit Mexico City. Later this year, 21 countries in the Western Hemisphere, including Mexico and the United States, signed the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, also known as the Rio Treaty. This treaty stated that an attack against one country would be considered an attack against all countries. Although Mexico formally withdrew from the treaty in protest over the U.S. intention to invade Iraq. My next example was Operation Wetback. Operation Wetback was an operation that was led by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it was supervised by the Immigration and Naturalization Services, also known as the INS. During this operation, roughly 750 U.S. Border Patrol agents swept through California and Arizona looking for unauthorized immigrants and sent them back to Mexico by bus and train. During this time, the INS claims that as many as 1.3 million immigrants were taken back to Mexico, and this number also included those who returned to Mexico under stress and duress. My next example is the rise of the maquiladores. The maquiladores were just a name for assembly plants, and they were built in border towns to employ low-cost Mexican labor who would assemble goods for the U.S. market. During this time, the maquiladoras quickly became labor magnets for Mexican living further south, which was a cause for more unauthorized immigration into the United States and more migration to the United States. During this time, by 1992, the plants employed roughly 500,000 Mexicans and exported over $19 billion. This was about 40% of Mexico's global exports during the time. The maquiladora industry not only strengthened economic ties between the countries, but it also strengthened cultural ties between the countries. The war on drugs was declared by Richard Nixon in September 1969, and this launched an aggressive search and seizure counter-narcotics operation on the U.S. and Mexico border. Thousands of agents were deployed along the border to inspect, quote, all persons and vehicles crossing into the United States. The Mexican country reacted with anger because they were not consulted about this operation. And in mid-October the same year, the operation was terminated and replaced with a bilateral cooperation agreement between the two countries. However, the cooperation between the two countries did not last, as the assassination of a DEA agent in Mexico in 1985 sparked outrage in the United States and led them to pursue a unilateral strategy to fight the war on drugs. My next example was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which also known as NAFTA. NAFTA was a trilateral agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and it went into effect in 1994. NAFTA pledged to eliminate tariffs over 15 years and make it its signatories, the second largest trading bloc after the European Union. NAFTA opens the door to new institutional relationships between the United States and Mexico on issues including military training, environmental degradation at the border, central bank cooperation, and rule of law. Economics widely concur that the agreement has had measurable positive effects on both the United States and Mexican economies. Some analysts even express surprise that the deal doesn't boost Mexico's economy more, although the rapid rise of low-cost Asian competitors may dull NAFTA's benefits. Now this NAFTA right here, this is what I think really opened the door for Mexicans and the Mexican and the United States government to really start talking and getting stuff done, like fighting the war on drugs and, just making their country safer. Which brings me back to my next point, the criminalization of the border. The U.S. concern over unauthorized immigration was on the rise, and the Mexican government exhibited a new willingness to engage on immigration issues. This led the Clinton administration to turn its focus to the border. By 1993, the INS budget reached $1.5 billion, but its strategy for tracking down undocumented immigrants was still widely ineffective. In February of 1994, the United States began a new law enforcement plan that increased border security and pushed for deportation of criminal aliens. In 1996, Congress then passed legislation that mandated jail time for some criminal aliens and granted power to local law enforcement in border states to uphold immigration laws. My next example was the collaboration on counter-narcotics. During this time in 1998, President Clinton became the first U.S. leader to visit Mexico since 1979. He promised the Mexican president a deal that he would avoid mass deportation of undocumented immigrants. That same year, Clinton signed a declaration with a deal committing for the first time to devise a joint strategy for combating drug trafficking. Although Mexico's economy largely recovered from the following 1994 devaluation of the peso, the low oil prices in the 1997 Asian financial crisis produced a lower than expected GDP growth rate of roughly 4.8% in 1998. So although Mexico and the United States were having pretty good relations and getting stuff done on the border and for safety reasons, Mexico still suffered economically. The expansion of the U.S. Border Patrol in 2004, this resulted more because of the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. This caused border security to really intensify. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security was created and reorganized the INS into Immigration and Customs Enforcement, what is known as ICE today. U.S. President Bush proposed a guest worker program during this time, but he met strong opposition in Congress. And so in 2004, the Congress authorized the hiring of an additional 10,000 Border Patrol agents, doubling the force to 21,000 agents by 2010. The Mexican migrants who used to return home seasonally now stayed in the United States of fear of being apprehended by Border Patrol and not being able to come back to the country. My next example was the bilateral border cooperation. The bilateral border cooperation happened when U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited Mexico City to discuss border security and counter-narcotic efforts after the killing of 3 people connected to the U.S. consulate happened in the city of Ciudad Juarez on March 13 of 2010. The first 3 months of 2010 were really dramatic as there was an increase in drug trafficking related deaths, which totaled more than 2,000. U.S. and Mexican authorities introduced a new stage in bilateral cooperation, and this new plan expanded the aid to Mexico to fight drug trafficking and reoriented focus toward improving social and economic conditions. So as you could see, most of the programs to fight the war on drugs and to fight counter narcotics, all those efforts were done after the NAFTA agreements signed by Canada, USA, and Mexico. So that is why I put it in my thesis that I believe that the NAFTA is what opened up the door for all these new policies to take place. Because before that, there was still a lot of arguing. And after NAFTA was passed, there was a bunch of stuff that got done, and although all this cartel stuff and counter narcotic efforts are still going on to this day, I don't think it would ever happen if the NAFTA wasn't signed, because Mexico and the United States wouldn't have that good of a relationship. And here are my works cited, and the end.